Okay, we're back. Welcome, freedom loving people, to the RH podcast. You got myself, Ryan Fugit, here with our multi time chief of station, 34 years in the US government across CIA, State Department, and the US Army, and good friend Glenn Korn, who is, as always, a world traveler today. Glenn, where are you at, or in general? Where have you been, and what part of the world are you in?
Well, hello, Ryan. Hello, everybody. It's great to see you. Those of you I can't see, it's great to imagine you. So it's. I have to say, I kind of missed you, Ryan, because we had like this when we started the program. We had like 5 or 6 in a row because everything that was going on with Alaska and the summit and the Zelensky meeting, and we had like a week off. So I'm sorry to the listeners, the followers, but now we have occasion to have a new show. I just came out of a couple of days in Turkey where I was kind of half business, half pleasure in Istanbul and on the coast, Bodrum, beautiful place.
I bet you ate well, Glenn. Is there like something you go back and you eat when you're there?
Like you cannot not eat. It's like you have to exercise a lot. Luckily, I did a lot of walking, so the food there is amazing. The hospitality is amazing. So it was a fascinating trip. Um, and then yeah, where else? I'm in Europe right now. I'll just say I'm in Europe.
Are people following you while you're walking these days? Like, do they not trust Glenn to be out on his own now?
To be honest with you, like I'm so blind I can't see. They could be like right behind me. I wouldn't know.
I don't believe that for a second. That's just your OPSEC here.
No, no,
So anyway, we'll jump in. There's so much to cover. I'm just going to hit the high points real quick because I am certain people will not be able to guess what we're going to start with, which is what you had pinged me about. And I am excited to hear about this. But so much going on with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the summit going on right now. You have Kim Jong-un taking a 20-hour armored train ride from his digs in the DPRK over to Tianjin in China. You've got Xi, you've got Putin, obviously Kim Jong-un. You had Modi front and center over the past couple days. Pakistan's there, a whole lot of other interesting characters. A lot coming out of that with Putin rejecting peace talks. Again, just with this mantra that nothing's going to happen. You have Russia, China signing a pretty significant energy pact. You got something weird going on with GPS jamming of the EU chief en route, had to precautionary land because of that, also attributed to Russia. A few other things going on. I want to talk Greenland with you later. But first, what nobody could have guessed is that we want to start with Glenn, over to you.
Okay. I mean, first of all, there's a lot to discuss, right? But let's start on a different side of the world, closer to home. Let's talk in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean. So I'm sure some of our followers are tracking the fact that the U.S. has deployed, I think, 5 naval vessels into the Caribbean, into the vicinity of Venezuela. My understanding from the media is the USS Iwo Jima, the San Antonio, but then 2, which is interesting, 2 landing craft, and then a Marine MEU, so a Marine Expeditionary Unit.
So, some other reporting is 7 warships, nuclear powered sub, and 4,500 personnel in a naval surge.
4,500 personnel is what I have. And obviously that's quite a large deployment into the Western Hemisphere. And it happened, I don't know, most Americans are probably not tracking this, but there are elections this Monday in Guyana, which was a British colony up until, I don't know how many years ago, but is now an independent country. And it is basically arguing with Venezuela over this area, which makes up most of Guyana, which is called, I'm going to get this wrong, but Essequibo, the Essequibo region, which is blessed with a lot of oil. And my understanding is ExxonMobil has the contract to help develop the oil capabilities there. I won't go into all the details. I pulled up as I was sitting on a flight on the amount of production that Guyana is now, oil production is now doing. But I think it was 50 million barrels a day now. Their goal is to be producing 1 million barrels by 2030. Okay.
And it looks like in the past 5 years, they've almost 5x'd their GDP, largely because of energy, from 5
Yes.
billion to 25 billion in the past 4
Yes.
years.
Yeah. So this is kind of a wonder find. And the Venezuelans are claiming that it's actually Venezuelan territory. And they've been making overtures and threats. And there was a threat of war last year, some kind of hostility. The Venezuelans have been flexing their muscles, trying to intimidate the people of Guyana, the government there. The government just had elections. They claimed that somebody opened fire on a boat that was moving a bunch of ballots related to the election. They claim the Venezuelans were behind that. The Venezuelans claim they were not. So when the question comes up, why did the U.S. deploy this naval contingent? Some people may claim that it was to send a message during the elections that we don't want the Venezuelans to do anything to disrupt the elections. I think the White House is claiming that it's in connection with its policy of going after narco traffickers in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere, which have been a major problem for the U.S. And that is definitely possible and also maybe part of what's going on. And then other people, including the Venezuelans, are claiming that this is a pressure campaign to undermine the dictator in Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, who has been holding on to power in undemocratic ways. I would say probably for the last 10 years. And what's interesting here is that, for me at least, is that this is a country that is an ally of Russia, China, and I would suggest Iran. All those countries have some kind of interest in Venezuela. And it might be that the administration is putting pressure on those countries through one of its allies and sending a message that, like, we're going back to the Monroe Doctrine, that we are not going to allow those countries to encroach on our interests in the Western Hemisphere. So if you remember, right after the election, the administration made a very big deal about putting pressure on the Panamanians to cede Chinese control, PRC control over the Panama Canal. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion. I think there was in the White House a policy of going after, authorizing the U.S. military to go after narco traffickers, which again present a very significant threat to the United States. So all of this happening, I just want people following our program to pay attention to it, because this is in our backyard. This is, direct interest to the United States. And I hope that one of the reasons that we're doing this is to send a message to Moscow and to Beijing and to Pyongyang and to Tehran that we can go after you anywhere in the world, just like you guys come after us and push on our interests. We can do the same thing to you.
And China is somewhat involved there already with infrastructure projects, bridge, roads, as they do in other parts of the world, namely Africa. Sounds like they've already started working there. And I do believe Sec State Rubio made a trip there earlier this year just to underscore the importance and kind of signal to Venezuela hands off.
Yes. Yeah. So our support for the small but important country of Guyana, I think, is significant. And of course, the natural resources that are there, that are at stake, are pretty important. And the free flow and access to that oil is pretty important.
I'm sure you knew some folks who worked the Caribbean and Latin America back in the day, Glenn. Was that ever a draw for you to try to go and do some work there? I feel like you would fit in very well in the Caribbean.
Wow. You know what? Like when I started, first of all, like in the 80s, people often forget, like the most of the action in the intelligence community and the special operations commands was in, Central America, El Salvador, right? The Contras, Sandinistas, Nicaragua. So there was a lot of stuff going on in Central America. And when I retired, I had the honor to speak at a luncheon that was organized by the veterans of the Latin America division. And it was fun to listen to them. One guy that I was sitting next to, he was the oldest guy in the room. He was the Dewan of the event. And he started telling me about how, like, he was stationed in one of these Central American countries, and somebody blew, like, the local opposition blew up his car outside of his house one day. And then they burned his house down. And I said, well, did Washington pull you out of there? He's like, no, they just told me go find another car and find another house. So that's like the old school. And I could tell a funny story, but I won't. I asked when I first came in, I indicated an interest in going to that part of the world. But because I had language skills that were not Spanish, which my wife, by the way, criticizes me to this day. She's like, why didn't you learn Spanish? I did not end up in Latin America, unfortunately. But yes, I know a lot of great people that served there. I'm sure you did too. And, within the organization, they were some of the funnest people to be around. They had the margarita machine.
That's right. I don't think it's too inside baseball, so we can cut this later if we need to. But I mean, they were known for having to be very stylishly dressed. They come back with like nice fitted suits, and they've got the margarita machine there back at headquarters. Yeah, right. Good. I could have seen you there just for maybe a TDY or something.
Yeah. And, the only last time I was in Central America was when my brother was in the Army in Panama, and I went to visit him. So, yeah.
Okay.
By the way, great place.
All right. What should we jump to next? Lots to choose from. You want to go to the SCO next? What's going on in China and Russia?
Sure. I mean, I think the significance here, well, there's a couple of things that are pretty significant. You mentioned like the gas deal between Russia and China. I'd be a little bit hesitant to believe that there's really too much coming out of that because we hear this a lot. Xi Jinping and Putin meet, they talk about the strategic partnership, they talk about all these deals. My experience in diplomacy is that there's a lot of framework agreements that are signed and then nothing ever comes of them because, the devil's in the details. But if there is an agreement, I would suggest that the Chinese are going to be the winners and the Russians are going to be the losers because they're having to sell their oil and gas at very cheap prices to Beijing and New Delhi and other players that are still buying Russian oil and gas. And so I'm sure that Xi Jinping is basking in the limelight of this big event. He got a lot of attention. People were saying at Alaska, oh, President Trump was letting Putin, come in from the cold and get all this attention. He's been so isolated. That is a fallacy, in my opinion, because he's been talking to all these leaders since 2022. By the way, the Turkish president was in China for this event, right, who's been speaking with Putin regularly. And my understanding is he tried to convince Putin again to make peace in Ukraine, and Putin again rejected President Erdogan's efforts.
Let me ask you something about that, Glenn, if I can. The way it was reported, Erdogan mentioned that Putin and Zelensky weren't ready to come to the table yet for a one-to-one or even a trilat. But Zelensky's not there. Any reason he's making that statement? Like, do you think he is talking to Zelensky, or is it just he's talking to Putin and feels like whatever Putin said is not going to be enough to bring Zelensky into the table?
No, I mean, we know he's speaking with Zelensky. As a matter of fact, earlier in the week, when the Russians opened up a devastating air attack that killed a number, I think it was 37 total civilians on Ukrainian, cities and towns. President Erdogan was the one leader who I'm aware of who called President Zelensky right after that to express his condolences and express his continued support for Ukrainian sovereignty. So we know he's talking to President Zelensky, and the Turkish policy all along has been that they're going to try and talk to both sides. What President Trump has been trying to do since being elected, President Erdogan has been doing since 2022. And President Erdogan has not been shy about criticizing what he felt was the Biden administration's overly aggressive, behavior and the EU's overly aggressive behavior. And so it's a very complicated issue because within NATO, they've done some things that are very important, like they closed the straits to military traffic, which was very important. One of the reasons the Russians called this a special military operation was because they didn't want the Turks to have the ability to, or they were trying to encourage the Turks not to enact the Montreux Agreement, the clause where it says that they can shut down the straits or the Bosphorus to military vessels moving in and out. But the Turks did that anyway, which got to applaud them for that. And it's made life hard for the Russians. Of course, it's meant that the U.S. can't move, other NATO countries can't move vessels into the Black Sea either from the Mediterranean. But I think the Russians have been the bigger loser there. And again, going back to the Turks and the Ukrainians, they've been very active. Many people don't know this, but in 2021, President Erdogan received President Zelensky in Istanbul for kind of a summit. And I think the Russians kind of made it known that if that happened, they were going to punish the Turks. And what did that mean? How did they punish the Turks? The two main ways it was in April of 2021. And right after that, the Russians announced that Turkey was not safe for travel because of COVID. And that meant that was a huge hit to the Turkish tourist industry because there are a lot of Russian tourists that come every year, charter flights. And that hurt the Turks. And I think the Turks knew that was going to happen, but President Erdogan took a principled stance. He met Zelensky and he publicly stated that Crimea was Ukrainian territory and he supported Ukraine's right to its territorial integrity. And then they talked about joint defense production. And last week, the Russians hit a Turkish defense production facility in Ukraine, Bayraktar, which is the UAVs. If you remember in the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion, the Bayraktars, in fact, there are Ukrainians who named their children after the Javelins and the Bayraktars because they were big players in the initial counter offensives or defensive operations of the Ukrainians in February, March, April of 2020, even a little bit later. So there were songs about the Bayraktar. Oh, Bayraktar. Yeah. But the Russians just hit one of the Turkish defense plants. The Russians hit an American facility that was producing electronics in Western Ukraine. And the Russians have hit Azeri infrastructure, so related to SOCAR. I think they hit some terminals that the Azeris have been.
Yeah, in Odessa.
In Odessa.
Hit twice in the past in August over a span of 10 days.
Right. We could do a whole nother show just on what's going on between Azerbaijan and Russia right now and the South Caucasus and the tensions there, which we should do. But anyway, going back to the SCO, what amazes me, Ryan, is that there are a lot of people now coming out talking about like the coalition between, Beijing, Moscow, Pyongyang, Tehran. This has been going on for years. Anybody that didn't see it was either not paying attention or just kind of woefully blind because we should have seen this coming for a long time. These are countries that do not accept the rules-based order that people in Brussels and Washington talk about, right? And they've been pushing back and trying to undermine the US and our allies for years. I just say I hope that our allies and folks in Washington realize this is time to come together and really it's almost like a Cold War 2.0 between NATO and the Warsaw Pact.
I think what was so interesting over the past 2 days, you're right, those are I would call them the usual suspects, and I don't think many folks who follow this would be surprised to see that congregation. But I do think Modi holding hands on stage with Xi Putin wouldn't have had to have happened. But I do think tariffs and some of the discussion between Modi and Trump over the ceasefire from the April conflict with Pakistan had something to do with it and probably pushed Modi onto that stage that's probably not great for us. Now, India is a member of the SCO, so it's not unusual for them to be there, but so front and center, I think, was timing that doesn't look great for us.
Right. And of course, they just went through a dust up with the Chinese, I think less than a year ago, a lot of tension, right? And of course, you mentioned the Pakistanis were at this meeting, and the Pakistanis and the Indians, there's long, long history of tension there, bad blood, right? We almost did go into a full-fledged war, two nuclear-armed countries were, at each other's throats not that long ago. So to see them all together is interesting, but I wouldn't put too much into it because I think there's a lot of ceremony and a lot of show. And my own assessment is these are countries that are sending a message to Washington and to Brussels that we want to be heard more, but we don't want to be dictated to. And this rule-based order that you guys have been talking about doesn't always suit our interest, right?
Do you think that this will change maybe the tariffs specifically with India? I feel like it's not going to change much with China, Russia, certainly not North Korea, even Iran. But maybe with India, do you think this will lead to us backing off a little bit?
That's a great question. The tariffs are in connection with the secondary sanctions, right? The administration now is getting some criticism because President Trump said, he gave a deadline and then he gave the 50-day deadline and then he shortened it. Then he extended it when he met with President Putin in Alaska to try and sustain some diplomatic momentum, is my guess. Now people are saying, okay, it's time to do something because the Russians went to Alaska. They agreed to some stuff apparently, and then afterwards they backed away from it. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, coming out and saying we didn't agree to, any security guarantees other than Russia providing the security guarantee for Ukraine. Good luck with that. And then they've just continued to go after like Ukrainian targets and large scale attacks. So the mess, and you mentioned some other things which have been interpreted as sabotage or gray zone operations to undermine some of our allies. And people are saying, okay, we need to respond now. And personally, I'm one of those people. I think we need now to send a message back, like we've given you a chance, and the United States needs to show Vladimir Putin we're serious, that we're not going to be bullied, and we're not going to let the countries that are side by side with us be bullied.
What message do you send there?
Well, this goes back to there have been a lot of talk from the beginning of this administration. President Trump said on his first day in office that he could raise like the economic stakes, put on like the pressure on Moscow much, much more than it was on them when he came into office, right? And that's secondary sanctions. That's doing other things to punish those countries that are doing business with Russia, buying oil and gas, trading, letting Russia send its products through, white labeling their products through those countries, banking stuff. And so that's what we did with India. So now if we back off, is it a win for Putin, right? And is it a loss for those who say that we need to up the ante for Putin? And, I had many talks with my Turkish friends because, Turkey's another country where our policy has been very, very nuanced. I give the previous administration credit and this administration credit for trying to find the balance with our, Turkish allies because they're very dependent on Russian gas and oil, and their economy is very dependent on the Russian economy. And so how do you wean them off that? if you go secondary sanctions in India, the Indians are going to say, what about the Turks?
Yeah.
Right? Why? And then the Emiratis, because all these countries are doing some kind of business with Russia. So it's very complicated.
I would assume that's just one of the levers we have to pull, though, would be secondary sanctions with India, and probably could look elsewhere. Maybe it's Turkey or another third party or third country. But is there not more support to Ukraine, maybe to Europeans, or something directly on Russia? Like, are those other avenues you might take?
Well, great question and great point, actually, because the administration just approved the delivery of long-range ordnance to the Ukrainians. So my understanding, there's a new shipment going, right? You could look at that as part of like the U.S. response, like a message back, like we're not right. There are other things we could definitely do. Again, you might say that what's happening in the Caribbean right now is part of a worldwide effort. I wrote an article about this in 2023. If you go back to like the Reagan doctrine of rollback, and you go back to like Iran, the Contra thing. One of the reasons we were doing that is the policy was wherever the Soviets are causing problems for us, we're going to push back on them, and we're going to make Moscow have to decide. They're going to spend money on building tanks for a fight in Europe, or they're going to have to spend money on propping up a regime in Angola, or they're going to have to spend money on propping up a regime in Cuba, right? So spread them thin. And some people could argue that, Venezuela could be part of that. I've been saying, again, since 2023, that we should be looking in places like the Western Hemisphere where the Russians are meddling in our interests to push back on them. In Africa, in North Africa, in the Balkans, across the world.
What's your hot take on when you think a peace deal might be reached? Are you thinking we got a month, 6 months, or not this year?
Yeah, I definitely don't think in a month. I don't see that happening. Maybe by the end of the year. That is very dependent on certain things happening and falling into place. And by the way, I understand the president's going to make an announcement tonight. Maybe he's making it while we're doing the podcast. Some people are hoping or thinking it may be connected with like his response to what Putin is doing. Who knows? But it depends on, in my opinion, what the response is going to be from the U.S. and from the West. Not just words, because we hear a lot of words, but what concrete actions are going to be taken to send a message back to Moscow that your refusal to really negotiate sincerely is going to be met with some kind of power.
If I can give you my own spicy take on this, Glenn, I think from what we've seen with Russia's economy, even this gas deal with China, I think speaks to this. Like, to your point, Russia loses in this because they're selling at such a cheap rate, but they're doing it because they have to. There's been reports of them bringing in laborers from Africa to staff various parts of their economy because, how difficult it is. They just redeployed some of their most elite forces to the front lines, presumably for an upcoming offensive. Maybe it's a fall offensive, but probably out of sequence from when they wanted to, because they're having to surge, which we experienced in the past 20 years as well, having to surge troops and what that does. I would argue that Russia can't sustain this past 18 months. I'd be interested in your take on that. Do you think that if they kept going and fighting, they could keep going beyond 18 months? And I suppose when I say 18 months, I am making an argument that I'm not confident the Russian public would continue to support Putin if this continued and we have maybe 1.5 million to 2 million wounded and killed in that country for this battle, and if the economy could handle it. Curious for your take.
Ryan, you bring up a great point. I think a lot depends on the response of the West. I mean, I don't like that term so much, but Europe, the United States, Japan, South Korea, other countries that are aligned with us, what the response is going to be. If we increase support for the Ukrainians or maintain support, even at its current level, and the Ukrainians have the weapons and the munitions to defend themselves, then I think, and the Russians, they're not making much progress right now. That's what everyone is saying. I heard our former boss, General Petraeus, say on a show recently, the Russians, it's going to take them years at the pace they're going to take, to capture the objectives that they've claimed they want to capture, like in Zaporozhye or, Kherson or Donetsk. In some cases, the Ukrainians are now on the counteroffensive. Again, they're taking some territory back. So the Russians are not making great progress. You bring up a great point too, like you just don't deploy an army, right? A military, sustain it, like logistically training, the effectiveness of your officer corps, your NCO corps. The constant rotations are painful, and they wear on an army after a while. This has been 3 bloody, long, hard years for both sides. But we should like somebody when we I think I said this on one of the other programs, but somebody who was a boxer who's now a Ukrainian politician said to us in a meeting, he said, when you're a boxer and you get into the 15th round, you're aching, you're in pain, you're tired, your legs are weak, your head is pounding, and you just have to remind yourself that the other guy too is in the same condition because he's also taken a beating, and you just have to outlast him. So if you look at that, Ukrainians have to outlast the Russians. To outlast the Russians, they need continued consistent
Yep.
support. And if we increase the economic pressure on Moscow, I think that will accelerate the timeline where the people around Putin are going to say enough. Because there are already people saying that. We're already hearing some signs of that. There's some, for the first time in a couple of years, we're hearing people say enough. This is not like we should just make a deal and end this thing. And I'm sure that there are people in Russia that heard President Trump say, I want to make a deal. And by the way, we can do business, right? I'm not opposed to opening up the United States, to business with Russia again. I'm not one of these I'm not, because the Russians always talk about Russophobia. He's not. He ran in 2016 on a platform of wanting to have a good relationship with the Russians. And although some people, that's like an anathema to them to hear today, I don't think it's such a bad idea, right? That's the carrot we've talked about.
No, I think we all agree on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if we
So
all agree. You and I agree on that.
what we can do now, in my opinion, is increase that pressure economically and politically. And that doesn't mean isolating Putin, because I think that's it's just unrealistic. There are too many countries that will continue to meet with him and talk to him. But there are other things that we can be doing. We shouldn't forget he lost his main ally in the Middle East, Syria, right? His other main ally, Iran, is wobbling. If you look, by the way, let's jump over to Iran. The Europeans enacted the snapback sanctions, right? The rial took a tailspin. Someone was telling me you have to have suitcases full of money to go buy anything now. The Iranian economy is a mess, and they just had a humiliating experience at the hands of the Israelis and then the U.S. Air Force. So his allies in the Middle East are in trouble, or they don't exist. I mean, his main ally is now living in an Airbnb in Moscow somewhere. Bashar
You
al-Assad.
think it's an Airbnb, or is he at what are they? A doc? Is it a dacha?
A dacha. I don't. He's probably living in a in-tourist hotel. But there are other things that we can do, and in my opinion, it's time to start doing some of those things. And I think we should tell our allies and those countries, listen, we don't want to cause economic problem for you, but we need to end this thing, right? We need to get it over with, and that means we're all going to have to, tighten our belts a little bit and feel the pain.
I guess on that, so to a few of your points, and I'm probably going to say something that you disagree with, so don't just agree with me because we're on air here. One thing that you had mentioned, Putin is losing some support. One of the things we put out that you can go listen to for folks is a deep dive on Dmitry Kozak, who is a longtime confidant of Putin's. I think his first chief of staff when he started out 25 years ago, very close to him over time. Did not know, and some of the research we dug up, and this is what you can go listen to, Ukrainian born. I guess at the outset of the war, he was very much against the fight and privately held this assessment that they should not invade Ukraine, made it known, and has slowly lost significant power. And he has been somewhat ostracized. He's not dead yet. He's still alive, but he has been sidelined effectively within the chief of staff organization for Putin. Just to give you an idea of someone who is very close to Putin over time. I think my hot take here, Glenn, that I think you'll probably disagree with me on is, we've come out so openly with our administration saying we want peace, that from a bargaining standpoint, Putin knows that's on the table. I don't think, again, I would argue it would be very hard for him to go 18 more months. If Ukraine is still supported by the US and Europe and economic sanctions and repercussions are put in place on Russia, I think it would be very hard for them to sustain.
Right.
That said, I do think they could make it 6 to 8 months, and they could make it to the cold weather fighting. And if I were Putin, I'd be doing a fall offensive, throwing what I've got at it while the fighting season's still there until things get cold, and then take a peace deal in the winter where I get some land. I impose my religion, my language on the land that I've been given. I can then rebuild, and I've forced Ukraine effectively to not be able to militarize again. That's my guess on what the outcome will be. Nobody knows. But because we've been so open about wanting a peace deal, I think he knows it's there and it's timing for him. So I don't blame him for what he's doing right now. And I guess the
Right.
thing that really, I'll shut up here in a second. The thing that's tough for me is we didn't broker a peace deal or fight for a peace deal when the Soviets were in Afghanistan. I know it's not the same. The loss of life is greater, but that's one of the things that led to the end of the Soviet Union. And I know you've been very keen to point out that the Soviet Union did it to themselves. Their policies, their repression, a lot of the same things could be said of where Russia is today. With Putin's policies, the way their people have to live, absolute crackdown on any dissent. And we helped bring that to or maybe we accelerated it. I feel like we could be in a similar position.
Right. Well, actually, first of all, I don't disagree with you. By the way, if you're talking about Kozak, you got to give him credit for being against this. He called it right, in my opinion. A lot, a lot of people would not have had their lives ruined if they had listened to him. And anyone that argues that Putin's decision in 2022 was, calculated and smart, I think is foolish, because they've paid a terrible price. The Russians have paid a terrible price for what he did, this miscalculation. And the scenario, let's say you're talking about, let's say he gets that, right? And Ukraine has to accept some kind of Russian domination. And the Ukrainians it'll take 3 generations before they ever forgive the Russians for what they've done, right? There'll be a lot of problems. And you'll have a country which is not economically viable or stable on your border. Is that smart? No, right? The Russians could have so much more if they would just let Ukraine thrive.
Agree.
If they were not so xenophobic. But anyway, that's if not, coulda, woulda, shoulda, as my mother used to say. But that the scenario you're talking about is there's a danger, in my opinion, that could be the outcome. And in terms of the negotiating tactics, I'm not a master negotiator. I don't know. I kind of agree with you. This is just like my souk mentality. Like when you bargain in the Middle East, you never go in and say, I want to buy that carpet.
Right.
Right. Yeah. I used to tell my wife, do not even show any interest. By the way, I have to give a shout out here to my sister-in-law, Adriana, who is the best at this. I saw her in the Brand Bazaar in Turkey and all the carpet shops. She, like, when the carpet salesman would say, my brother would go, oh, that's a nice carpet. She go, I don't want that. And like, that's the good way to do it, right? But I do think, maybe the president was trying to say, like, this dialogue or this has been very one-sided. And you can't talk to Putin if you keep demonizing him. And some people have suggested those voices have been very quiet since 2022, because if they would say, something like, hey, we should maintain a dialogue with the Russians, they'd be beaten down and accused of being weak and pro-Putin's puppets or whatever, right? And that's unfortunate too, because that's not healthy, like in diplomacy and foreign policy like debate. But there have been those people that have said, like, we shouldn't demonize any foreign leader because we have to, like, talk with them at some point. So I think the president, this is just my guess, was trying to maintain some, like, open the door for a dialogue, hoping that Putin would take the opportunity. Maybe the miscalculation is that Putin wants peace. And I don't know that Putin wants peace. I think Putin is happy to have this instability, including going back to, like, the danger of a fractured and unstable Ukraine in the future. He prefers that to having a stable, neighbor, because it's a control issue. Like, I think it comes down to that.
Which is crazy that that's what you'd want instead of a great trading partner with common, yeah.
And there's a danger too, Ryan, of, okay, the Russians now, let's say they go until December and then they say, okay, we're ready to negotiate. And they come to the negotiating table and say, okay, we'll go by these conditions. And one of those conditions, you have to open up trade with Russia. You have to end, like, sanctions and do all this stuff. And they allows the Russian economy to come back to a better spot. And of course, the Ukrainians are very worried the Russians are going to do that. And then they're going to rearm. And the Ukrainians are not going to be able to do that without a lot of significant help from the West.
Yeah. So I did an interview yesterday that we released this morning. You probably haven't seen, with my dad, who the 3 of us will do something together, Glenn. He was a political counselor in Islamabad. He was a political advisor at CENTCOM. He spent a lot of time at NATO. And just talking through this and just what we understand of history, I'd be curious for your take. Do you think, let's say that there is a ceasefire in 6 months, Russia rearms over the next 5 years, maybe Ukraine can do the same. Do you think Russia tries to continue to expand elsewhere? If you think of Moldova, the Baltics, or some other part of Europe?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, look, let's not forget that 25% of Georgian territory is occupied. Moldova was, a chunk of Moldova was split off. This is my argument when people say, NATO caused this by expanding east, right? What people forget is that as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russians were causing mayhem in the Caucasus, in Transnistria, in Moldova. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely a danger that they'll look for another spot to push. If they think, because, this is just my concern with the Russians, they feel that the whole world is surrounded, like is teaming up on them all the time. In fact, when I was in Turkey, I spoke to somebody, he said, that's what they do. They constantly talk about how the world is ganging up on them. And the US is trying to surround them and smother them and struggle them, suffocate them out of existence. And so it's very difficult to find a common language with somebody who's so paranoid
Yeah.
and so worried and xenophobic, unfortunately. And there are reasons, and we talked about this on the first time we did the podcast, a couple of years ago. There are reasons historically the Russians have this kind of deep, deep fear. And, how do we have to keep trying to figure out how to address it. Otherwise, everyone around them suffers.
Right. I'm gonna make a slight pivot, unless there's anything else you want to keep on this topic. All right. Did you see the news in the past week of the U.S. Charge d'Affaires in Copenhagen being called in to be reprimanded for what the Danes are saying is intelligence, that there are a few folks in Greenland being pushed by the U.S. trying to influence public sentiment in Greenland so that it will eventually revert back and secede and become U.S. territory?
I did read something about that. Obviously, very complicated issue. I would hope that we're not doing that. We have other things, other fish to fry. And it's possible that some group is doing that, but it's not sanctioned by the U.S. government. Who knows? It's so complicated.
I'm gonna go out on a limb here and just hope that this had nothing to do with the U.S. government and that we did not expend even 1 hour's time from some government employee, some GS-12, to run some type of campaign like this in Greenland. I hope to God this is not something we're doing.
I hope so as well. And again, we have other things other fish to fry. And of course, the Danes are our NATO partners. They're an incredibly important partner and good partner.
Yes.
And I know that some people claim that early on in the administration, they highlighted Greenland because we were concerned that the defense of Greenland was being ignored, right? Which is very important for U.S. national security. So that's to me, a legitimate discussion to have with Copenhagen, but not sending groups in to advocate or do covert action. I mean, by the way, how hard would that be in Greenland? There's only how many people are there? And I encourage
I'm with you.
Listen, honestly, the extent of my knowledge of Greenland goes back to a Conan O'Brien show. I don't know if you ever watched Conan Without Borders. I don't know if I can do a plug for another show, but I love that show. And he goes to Greenland. Have you ever seen that episode?
No, I've not seen this one.
I highly recommend it to you and all the viewers. It's very funny. This is after the first Trump administration when they said, President Trump said he may want to buy Greenland. Right. Which, by the way, he just met Putin in Alaska. We bought Alaska from Russia. It's not unheard of to buy territory. Countries do that. But Conan O'Brien, very, very funny show. But the gist of the show was Conan O'Brien went with a suitcase of money and said to some parliamentarian in Greenland, will you sell me Greenland? And she said, no. Okay, so they're not going to sell Greenland. Why would we do that? But I don't really know that much about Greenland. I do know that there are concerns about security in the Arctic and resources in the Arctic. And that's, a very important issue. But the way to address that, I think, is, okay, we've gotten some attention from Denmark, from the Danes. Now let's have a dialogue on how we increase security together and with other members of NATO and other members of by the way, this idea of NATO too, like I said before, the South Koreans, look at the North Koreans are fighting. Now they've admitted that they have, it wasn't a surprise. I can tell you the Ukrainians know for sure, but they have North Korean troops fighting in Ukraine and in Kursk Oblast, right? The South Koreans, where are you guys? I did an episode before Voice of America I did an episode for their South Korean service about this when the first news came out, which by the way, was a lot of fun. Although I didn't understand a lot of what people were saying, but I had a lot of fun. I liked fun going to the studio, but at the time I said, okay, if the North Koreans are going to deploy troops, then let's hope that the South Koreans will, at a minimum, increase their support for the Ukrainians, like military sales, weapons production, because the South Koreans are one country that never really let their defense industry dwindle. because they've always had the threat of North Korea.
Yeah.
And they're very capable. Anyone that's ever served with the South Koreans or worked with them knows they can be very, very capable.
Extremely capable. And I should note the Danes fought alongside us in the past 20 years in really crappy places people can't find on a map, and they lost people. And they are
Yes.
incredibly talented when it comes to fighting. So, hey, I wanted to ask you about Voice of America, Glenn. That's it. Admittedly, I never really listened to it. I know you've worked in some very challenging places, and I don't know how important you felt Voice of America was in some of those areas, just to get news to people that might not ever get it. But just curious about your thoughts.
Wow. I did listen to Voice of America when I was studying languages because they always had they have like a Turkish service, Uzbek service. So I did over the years listen to it, probably more than most Americans would. I don't know how relevant it was, at some point because it was tied to the US government and so it was known as being like Voice of America, US government kind of information source. There were times when I thought the reporting was kind of anti-American, which I always found odd, right? Because, I think it was created to counter Soviet, propaganda against the United States. So I'll be honest, there were times where I thought it was like there was a little political bias in the reporting, and it was almost like sometimes I felt like it's anti-American, which bothered me, honestly. The debate about we should definitely have some tool like Voice of America, in my opinion. Soft power is critical.
Yeah, I agree.
I think Voice of America, I don't know if it needed to be shuttered. I think it needed to be reformed to some degree, right? And now, like the next question is, when you look at our national debt, like we're talking about all these national security issues, like that's a national security issue in my opinion. It's an important one, right? If you're the CEO of a company and you have to cut like non-essential stuff, someone may say, okay, that is non-essential, and everyone's saying my thing is essential, right? That's natural. But my preference would have been not to shut down Voice of America, but to reform it and re-energize it and refocus it,
Yeah.
right?
Maybe Glenn and Ryan on there. Get
Yeah,
something new.
I mean so being some people argue like you don't need it anymore because there are brilliant guys like Ryan doing podcasts like this that are reaching a lot of people.
But the argument is you can't penetrate, right? I mean, like some of these places, they don't have access to Ryan and Glenn or the more authoritative ones.
Yeah, but I mean nowadays like it's a little bit different. Like in the Soviet Union they blocked it. They tried to block it. Like I think our podcast I'm sure there are people in Russia listening to these podcasts. People are getting
Just
it.
wait till we start, and I'm not joking here. There will come a time not too far in the future where we're translating this, where it's two Russians reading this
I hope
somehow.
so. I
Yeah.
hope so. But a lot of the content is, I don't know, I think probably people listening to shows like this or Joe Rogan get more out of that, trying to understand America than, what we had. Because, like, I'm not criticizing the people at Voice of America. I don't want to, the people I met there were very nice. They were very professional. And I think they believed in what they were doing, but maybe like the mechanism was a little bit outdated.
Yeah.
And we definitely have to have tools of soft power. I know a young lady who does what's it called? Instagram or Twitter. She has like a Twitter thing. I did one little episode with her and it had over 100,000 viewers like in 3 days. Right. So maybe we have to look at new ways to
Yep.
get the
100%.
message across.
All right. And
By the
then,
way, I wasn't dancing in that video. I wasn't like TikTok.
really,
No, I
we'll
wasn't.
see. If you were, it was a deep fake. Last thing, just before we let people go here, or if there's other stuff you want to cover, Glenn, I will say you made me think of this. For those who listen to our daily intel podcast that we put out, kind of the news on China and Russia, 7 minutes or less, we did upgrade to a new voice, Delilah, that
Delilah.
you seem to like. You said it was better than the previous guy, which everybody has told me as well.
Well, one of our listeners who is a athlete and he listens to the podcast when he runs, he sent me some feedback saying, hey, like the first one wasn't great. You changed it based on the advice of a very wise woman, from what I understand, some input from one of your listeners, your number one fan,
That's right.
right? And so thank her because the immediate feedback I got was, hey, that was great. Like this new voice is awesome. Delilah's a hit, right?
So there you go. So if you want to catch it, it's even better now, daily. Restrictedhandling.com. Just put in your email and you'll get that. You'll get the written report daily, and then you can link out on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
And if I could ask people, like, I think what we need is people to tell other people, like, listen to this podcast. If you think it's
Yeah.
worth it, please help us get the word out because we want to expand our network, right?
Absolutely.
Yes, we want to get to the point where we're translating. We could do it ourselves. We could do it. You probably speak what, French?
I
You
got French. Yeah.
French? You could do it in French.
Oui, bien sûr. Glenn, what else have we not covered today that we need to?
No, I don't know. I mean, we kind of covered a lot. We touched on some stuff. We didn't talk about Israel, Gaza, Lebanon. We can do that in another program. There's a lot of stuff happening there now as well. We really didn't touch on anything in Africa.
Nope, not at all. And I'd ask people, if you're listening and there's a topic you want to cover or go
Yeah.
deep on, just email me at info@restrictedhandling.com and we'll cycle that in.
Yes. All
Glenn,
right.
safe travels, my friend, wherever you're going. Stay safe. Looking forward to the next one.
À bientôt, monsieur. Let's do this again soon, all right? Oh.
I think you all are getting the right impression that you can't trust Glenn when he's talking about his poor language skills. That guy is a great Russian speaker. Okay, for those of you who made it this far, thank you so much. We really appreciate you staying with us. Please do share restricted handling with somebody you know. Get them involved. It'll help us do more with this to include translations and starting to get this into places where we can right now. That said, I did want to mention that if you go to restrictedhandling.com, you put your email in, you'll get our daily written news update. It's on China, Russia, Middle East, Iran, North Korea, all the stuff that I want to get daily, you can get as well. Same thing that I read. More importantly, it links out to our daily podcast on Russia and China, both under 7 minutes, all the news you need from that morning, literally as the world is waking up. You can have a look. And right now, I'm going to play for you the September 2nd RH version of the Russia-specific intel brief to give you an idea of what it sounds like. Again, if you're interested, head to restrictedhandling.com and just put your email in. Thanks. Stay safe.
Welcome to the Restricted Handling Podcast. Let's dig in. All right, let's jump straight into it. Russia is still all in on its war goals in Ukraine, and if you think that the peace talks are going anywhere, you might want to grab some popcorn because Putin's firmly planted in his position. At the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in China, Putin doubled down on his narrative that the entire mess started with a Western-provoked coup back in 2014. He's sticking to his claim that Ukraine's government is illegitimate and has to be replaced, which, let's be real, isn't exactly a hot take for him. This whole root cause theory he's pushing, it's basically the same old line that's been dragging this conflict along since the start. He keeps saying the West's meddling, NATO expansion, and of course, the ousting of Viktor Yanukovych are the real culprits. So, no peace talks anytime soon. He's not backing down. Meanwhile, Trump's been trying to line up this big trilateral meeting, but Putin's throwing cold water on that idea. Not happening. And that's not just your typical Putin move. It's a clear indication that he's not willing to entertain any real negotiations, which makes it tough to see how this ends anytime soon. Switching gears to something a little more, let's say, cordial. China and Russia just signed a monster deal. Now, when I say monster, I mean it. The Power of Siberia 2 pipeline is now a done deal, and it's a game changer for Russia's energy relationship with China. They're talking about pumping 106 billion cubic meters of gas to China every year, so you can imagine Beijing's position right now. You thought Russia was isolated because of the sanctions? Well, it turns out China is just here to back up its buddy with a truckload of cash and energy. A little underhanded? Maybe. But it's all about that mutual, we don't trust the West bond. I guess when the rest of the world is tightening its grip, you get a buddy pass to the best energy deals club. Putin and Xi just raised a glass to a friendship that's stronger than a lot of what we're seeing out of the West right now. Don't get me wrong, it's a strategic partnership, but it's also a big middle finger to Western influence in the region. Now, speaking of giving the West the finger, we've got some more Russian hybrid warfare happening in Europe. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's plane just got hit with some good old-fashioned Russian GPS jamming. And when I say good old-fashioned, I'm talking about that vintage Soviet-era style of interfering with communications and air traffic. It's like Russia's playing this digital cat-and-mouse game, where they're constantly testing the limits of international norms and seeing what they can get away with. Von der Leyen's plane had to land safely in Bulgaria, but not without a hitch. They had to ditch the tech and rely on paper maps, which, is so 90s, right? If you've ever tried using a paper map, you'll understand why that's not the go-to solution for today's travel. The fact that Russia is still pulling these stunts speaks volumes about how they see things. If they can disrupt, they will. And this isn't the first time either. Remember those other incidents in the Baltics, Poland, Finland? Yeah, it's the same playbook. But let's take a breath here. Let's shift back to something a little more interesting on the battlefield front. Ukraine's getting a little more creative, a little more DIY, if you will, with its weapons systems. The big news here is the Flamingo cruise missile. This is the missile you want to know about. Ukraine just tested it on August 30th with a strike on a Russian border post in Crimea. And no, this isn't some backyard operation. This missile is legit. It's got a range of up to 3,000 kilometers and a warhead that can carry up to 1,150 kilograms of payload. Yeah, Ukraine's moving from "we just need some help" to "we got this." So, with their new missile and drones buzzing around, Ukraine is building up a military that looks more self-reliant by the day. They're not waiting for the West to come bail them out. They're taking things into their own hands. It's a huge flex for Ukraine, proving they're not just relying on their partners, but stepping up to the plate with homegrown tech. If they keep going at this pace, they might not need anyone to come to the rescue in the long term. Speaking of things heating up, Russia's military efforts are definitely still rolling full throttle. Reports are saying that Russian forces have redeployed some serious firepower to Donetsk Oblast. The elite naval infantry and airborne forces are now taking charge of securing that region. This is a sign that Russia is focusing on seizing all of Donetsk, with some attention specifically around the towns of Pokrovsk, Dobropilya, and Kostiantynivka. So, while they're losing tons of manpower and resources in the process, they're also doubling down, hoping to make these small but costly advances add up to something that looks like a win on the map. And the reality is, Russian forces are struggling. These redeployments show that the Russians are still trying to hold ground, but it's not like they're steamrolling the place. It's slow and steady, and we've seen this tactic play out before. Small, incremental victories. But the price for each piece of territory is high. You'd think by now Russia would be looking for a quick finish, but nope. This is more of the same. Oh, and for some more good times, let's talk about a little hybrid warfare on the side. Russian officials are back at it with the GPS jamming, and it's not just targeting planes. Remember how the Russians hit Kyiv with some of their biggest air raids in weeks? Yeah, they're still on the offensive, but the kicker here is the way Russia's been messing with civilian life too. Drone attacks have hit major Ukrainian infrastructure, which leads to civilian casualties. In Bila Tserkva, for example, a civilian was killed by an airstrike that damaged residential areas. It's all part of Russia's continuing effort to destabilize and terrorize the Ukrainian population. But here's the thing. This tactic isn't getting them any closer to the victory they want. It's just putting pressure on the people who are already going through the ringer. Russia seems to think this kind of stuff is going to break the resolve of the Ukrainians, but honestly, they're pushing people further into that "we're not giving up" mentality. Finally, before we wrap up, let's quickly check in with Turkey. Turkish President Erdogan, who has been playing this mediator role for a while now, just confirmed that neither Putin nor Zelensky is ready for a face-to-face meeting about the war. After talking to both leaders, Erdogan said the conditions just aren't right yet. This isn't a huge surprise considering how the two sides have been so far apart on pretty much everything. But what's wild here is that Erdogan's still trying. He's still keeping the diplomatic channels open. If you're hoping for peace talks to move forward, don't hold your breath, but at least someone's trying, right? That's it for today. Stay tuned, and we'll be back soon with more updates on the conflict and the evolving geopolitics around it. Catch you next time on the Restricted Handling Podcast.